Welcome back, Historiclingo! Today, we're not just watching history, we're living it. Join me as we journey back to the turbulent days of World War I, where every echo of the past becomes a lesson for today. This isn't just another history video. It's an English learning adventure where language meets legacy and where every word carries the heartbeat of those who came before us. When you learn English through the stories of our past, you're not just building vocabulary. You're connecting with the soul of humanity, feeling its pain, its hope, and its resilience. So, take a deep breath, silence your distraction, and remember, if you can't finish this journey today, that's okay. History never disappears. The past will always be here, patiently waiting for your return. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe and tap the bell icon so you'll never miss a story that brings English and history to life. Chapter 1. The Prelude of the Great War. The First World War was not merely a conventional clash between nations. It was a tragedy of humankind, a cataclysm that dragged millions into the abyss of ambition, hatred, and political folly. It was not born overnight, nor was it simply a matter of national pride or border disputes. Rather, it was the inevitable eruption of tensions that had been brewing for decades among the great empires of Europe, a convergence of deep-seated rivalries over power, influence, and the pursuit of dominion. By the closing decades of the 19th century, Europe stood as a volatile arena of imperial competition. Britain and France, with their vast colonial empires, controlled much of the globe's wealth, resources, and trade routes. Germany, having unified only in 1871 under Otto von Bismarck, rose swiftly into a formidable industrial power, yet lacked a colonial network comparable to its rivals. This imbalance fueled resentment and a hunger for recognition. Germany's leaders saw themselves surrounded, hemmed in by the established powers, and longed to assert their place in the world order through expansion and militarization. The late 1800s thus marked the dawn of an age of alliances and armaments. In 1882, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy formed the Triple Alliance, while France, Britain, and Russia countered with the Triple Entente in 1907. The continent became polarized, two massive military blocs staring each other down across a field of suspicion and fear. What had once been a web of treaties meant to maintain peace had turned into a trap, ready to pull every signatory into war should any spark ignite it. Meanwhile, the Industrial Revolution had transformed warfare. Advances in steel production, rail transport, and communications enabled the mass mobilization of troops on an unprecedented scale. New weapons, machine guns, heavy artillery, and dreadnought-class battleships rendered old military doctrines obsolete. Between 1900 and 1914, the number of active European soldiers tripled from 2.5 million to nearly 8 million. Armies stockpiled rifles and shells by the millions, as generals promised swift and glorious victories. But beneath this facade of confidence simmered unease. The arms race, the colonial rivalries in Africa and Asia, and the rise of nationalist movements within multi-ethnic empires all contributed to an atmosphere thick with paranoia. Each empire saw itself as both protector and victim, a mindset that made compromise impossible. The First World War, therefore, was not the result of a single event, but the consequence of systemic decay, a Europe locked in a deadly embrace of pride, fear, and ambition. The nations that entered 1914 did so not out of readiness, but out of blindness, marching together into a storm that would consume an entire generation. Chapter 2. Europe on the Brink. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, Europe was a continent poised on the edge of transformation and destruction. Beneath the glittering surface of industrial progress and imperial pride, rivalries festered among nations that saw themselves as heirs to destiny. The old monarchies of Europe, drunk on ambition, prepared for the inevitable reckoning. Britain ruled the seas, its navy unmatched, its empire sprawling across continents. France, though scarred by its defeat in the Franco-Prussian War of 1871, had rebuilt itself with renewed vigor, determined never to bow again before Germany. Russia, vast and archaic, sought to expand its influence in the Balkans, presenting itself as the guardian of Slavic peoples. Austria-Hungary, by contrast, was a fragile mosaic of ethnicities, Germans, Hungarians, Slavs, and others bound together more by fear than unity. Germany, in the heart of the continent, was both ambitious and insecure. A young empire with immense industrial might, but surrounded by potential foes. And Italy, still wrestling with its own unification, dreamed of colonies and glory to rival its ancient Roman past. The map of Europe had become a chessboard of alliances and enmities. The Triple Alliance bound Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy together, promising mutual defense. In response, the Triple Entente linked Britain, France, and Russia. Though these alliances were meant to deter war, they achieved the opposite, turning every local quarrel into a potential continental inferno. Europe was now a system wired for catastrophe, one spark away from detonation. Yet it was not only the political alliances that deepened the peril. The arms race reached fever pitch. Germany sought to challenge Britain's naval supremacy by constructing a fleet of dreadnought battleships, each more powerful than any vessel before. Britain responded in kind, pouring fortunes into steel and gunpowder. On land, France and Germany expanded their armies to unprecedented sizes. By 1914, both nations had millions of men ready to march, drilled to perfection, confident that war would be swift and decisive. The Balkans, meanwhile, became the flashpoint of Europe, the so-called powder keg of the continent. Here, the ambitions of Austria-Hungary clashed with the nationalist aspirations of Serbia, which dreamed of uniting all Slavic peoples under its banner. Russia backed Serbia, while Germany stood behind Austria-Hungary. Each crisis, from Bosnia's annexation in 1908 to the Balkan Wars of 1912-1913, brought Europe closer to the edge. Diplomacy faltered, and trust dissolved into suspicion. By the dawn of 1914, the great powers had set the stage for disaster. Millions of soldiers stood ready, generals refined their war plans, and governments reassured their citizens that they could triumph in any conflict. None realized that the next war would not bring glory, but ruin that in seeking to prove their strength, they would tear the heart out of civilization itself. Chapter 3: The Spark in Sarajevo. On a quiet Sunday morning, the 28th of June 1914, in the Balkan city of Sarajevo, destiny took aim. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, arrived with his wife, Duchess Sophie, to inspect imperial troops. Their visit was meant to display strength and unity. Instead, it would ignite a war that would engulf the world. Among the cheering crowds lurked Gavrilo Princip, a 19-year-old Serbian nationalist and member of the secret organization known as the Black Hand. To him, the Archduke represented tyranny, a symbol of foreign domination over the Slavic peoples of the Balkans. As the royal motorcade passed, fate intervened. A wrong turn, a missed detour, a chance encounter. Princip stepped forward, drew his pistol, and fired 2 shots. Franz Ferdinand and his wife were dead within minutes. The bullets fired in Sarajevo echoed across Europe. To the rulers of Austria-Hungary, the assassination was more than an act of terrorism, it was an opportunity. Backed by Germany's assurance of support, the empire delivered an ultimatum to Serbia filled with deliberately impossible demands. Though Serbia accepted most conditions, Austria-Hungary rejected the response and declared war on the 28th of July 1914. The fuse had been lit. Within days, the network of alliances transformed a local dispute into a continental cataclysm. Russia, protector of Serbia and self-proclaimed defender of all Slavic nations, mobilized its armies on July 30. Germany, interpreting this as a provocation, declared war on Russia on August 1, and 2 days later on France, Russia's ally. To reach France swiftly, Germany invaded neutral Belgium, violating its sovereignty and horrifying the world. Britain, bound by treaty to defend Belgium, declared war on Germany on August 4. In the span of a single week, Europe was at war. What began as a localized crisis had spiraled beyond control. Millions of men answered their nation's calls, marching beneath banners of patriotism and illusion. They believed they would return home by Christmas. They believed war could still be glorious. None could foresee the trenches, the poison gas, and the rivers of blood that awaited them. From that day forward, the assassination at Sarajevo was remembered not just as a tragedy, but as the spark that set the world ablaze, a moment when one man's pistol shot unleashed the greatest storm in human history. It was not destiny, but choice and arrogance that plunged civilization into chaos. Chapter 4. The Outbreak of War. When the guns first roared in August 1914, few understood that the world had entered a new age of destruction. Across Europe, church bells rang and crowds cheered, believing the war would be swift, a glorious march that would end before Christmas. Yet beneath the patriotic fervor lay a grim reality. The industrial age had turned killing into a science, and this would be no brief adventure, but a nightmare without end. Germany, executing the Schlieffen Plan, struck west through neutral Belgium in a lightning offensive aimed at encircling Paris and defeating France before Russia could mobilize in the east. The invasion shocked the world. Belgian resistance was fierce but short-lived. Its cities were reduced to rubble. Civilians were executed, and the first images of war's brutality filled newspapers across Europe. Britain, bound by the treaty guaranteeing Belgium's neutrality, declared war on Germany on August 4, joining the conflict that now engulfed the continent. By late August, the German armies surged deep into France. French forces, relying on the overly optimistic Plan 70II, launched counterattacks dressed in bright blue and red uniforms, a tragic mismatch against machine guns and heavy artillery. They suffered devastating losses in battles at Ardennes and Charleroi. Within weeks, German troops were within 50 kilometers of Paris. Panic swept the capital. Government officials prepared to flee. But the tide turned at the First Battle of the Marne, September 612, 1914. The French, under General Joffre, regrouped and counterattacked with desperate determination. In what became known as the Miracle of the Marne, hundreds of thousands clashed along the Marne River. Casualties soared past 500,000. The German advance stalled, and the Schlieffen Plan collapsed. Both sides, exhausted and bloodied, began to dig, and thus began the grim era of trench warfare. Across the continent, the war spread like wildfire. On the Eastern Front, Russia moved swiftly into East Prussia, but was crushed at the Battle of Tannenberg, August 2630, losing more than 90,000 men. Yet the Russian advance diverted enough German troops to save France from collapse. In the Balkans, tiny Serbia stunned the world by repelling Austro-Hungarian invasions at the Battle of Sur and Kolubara, marking the first major Allied victories of the war. By the end of 1914, the conflict had spread beyond Europe. The Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers, opening fronts in the Middle East. Japan, eager to expand its influence, declared war on Germany and seized its Pacific colonies. The First World War had become a truly global conflict, a storm that would claim millions before the first year was done. The old world had fallen into darkness. The optimism of August had vanished, replaced by trenches, mud, and the unending thunder of guns. Chapter 5. The Stalemate of the Trenches, 1915. By early 1915, the dream of a short war had died. What replaced it was a grim stalemate stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss border, nearly 700 kilometers of trenches carved into the soil of France and Belgium. Here, men lived, fought, and died in the mud. Life in the trenches was a waking nightmare. Rats the size of cats, constant shellfire, and the stench of decay. The Western Front had become a static graveyard, where each side fought for mere meters of ground at a cost of thousands of lives. Both armies sought to break the deadlock. In February 1915, the French launched the Champagne Offensive, hammering German positions with relentless artillery. The ground gained was measured in meters, the losses in tens of thousands. Every assault ended the same way, men charging into machine gun fire, disappearing into smoke and silence. On the German side, a new and terrifying weapon was unveiled. In April, at the Second Battle of Ypres, German forces released clouds of chlorine gas across Allied lines. For the first time in history, chemical warfare was unleashed on a massive scale. Thousands suffocated in agony, their lungs burned by poison. It was a glimpse into a new kind of horror. Elsewhere, the war expanded into fresh hells. Italy, enticed by promises of land and glory, betrayed the Triple Alliance and joined the Allies in May 1915 through the Treaty of London. Its armies attacked Austria-Hungary along the Isonzo River, where the steep mountains and glacial valleys became battlefields of misery. 4 major offensives were fought that year, each ending in blood-soaked stalemate. Soldiers froze to death in the Alps, buried by avalanches or crushed beneath falling ice. Nature itself became an enemy. In the east, Germany and Austria-Hungary struck back against Russia in the Gorlice-Tarnów offensive. Superior coordination and modern weaponry shattered the poorly supplied Russian forces. Entire divisions were annihilated, and by summer, the Central Powers had driven the Russians hundreds of kilometers eastward. The once mighty Tsarist army was bleeding to death, its soldiers demoralized and starving. Meanwhile, on the southern front, the Allies attempted to open a new route to Russia by attacking the Dardanelles. The Gallipoli campaign, launched in April 1915, was meant to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war. But under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal, later Ataturk, the Turkish defense proved unbreakable. The beaches of Gallipoli became killing grounds, and by year's end, over 250,000 Allied soldiers were dead, wounded, or missing. It was a humiliation that scarred nations, especially Australia and New Zealand, whose troops had fought and died there. By the close of 1915, the optimism that had once driven the armies of Europe was gone. Neither side could advance. Both were trapped in a war of exhaustion. The trenches had devoured the youth of a continent, and the end was nowhere in sight. Chapter 6. The War of Attrition, 1916–1917. By 1916, the First World War had transformed into a monstrous engine of death. The optimism that once fueled nations was gone, replaced by despair and determination to outlast the enemy. Victory was no longer measured in territory gained, but in lives destroyed. It was a war of attrition, a contest of endurance between nations bleeding themselves dry. The year opened with Germany's assault on the fortress city of Verdun in February 1916. The plan, conceived by General Erich von Falkenhayn, was simple and cruel: bleed France white. Verdun held deep symbolic value for the French people. Germany believed that by attacking it relentlessly, they could break the nation's spirit. For 10 months, waves of soldiers clashed in a cauldron of fire and steel. Under General Philippe Pétain, the French held their ground with the cry, "Ils ne passeront pas," they shall not pass. By the battle's end, both sides had fired over 40 million artillery shells. More than 700,000 men were killed or wounded, and yet the front lines barely shifted. Verdun became a symbol of endurance and of the insanity of industrial warfare. To relieve pressure on Verdun, the British launched their own offensive on the Somme River in July 1916. The first day, July 1st, remains the bloodiest in British history. 57,000 casualties, including 19,000 dead in just 24 hours. The British introduced a new weapon, the tank lumbering metal beasts meant to crush barbed wire and terrorize the enemy. Yet the early models were slow, unreliable, and easily destroyed. The offensive dragged on until November, leaving over 1 million men dead or wounded on both sides for a few kilometers of barren ground. On the Eastern Front, the Russians sought redemption with the Brusilov offensive in June 1916. It was their finest moment of the war. Using innovative tactics and surprise, General Alexei Brusilov shattered Austro-Hungarian lines, capturing 400,000 prisoners and nearly collapsing the empire. But Russia's gains could not be sustained. Shortages of weapons and food soon halted the advance. Still, it marked the beginning of Austria-Hungary's slow disintegration. By 1917, exhaustion gripped every front. Soldiers mutinied, civilians starved, and governments wavered. The Allies attempted one more massive push in France, the Nivelle offensive, promising a quick victory. Instead, it became another massacre, leading to open mutiny in the French army. Across Europe, hope was dying. The war had become a self-sustaining catastrophe, feeding on the blood of men who no longer knew why they fought. And yet, in this darkness, the world was about to change. Revolutions brewed in the East, and across the Atlantic, a new power stirred. The war that had begun as a European tragedy was about to become a global reckoning. Chapter 7: Revolution and the American Entry. By early 1917, Europe was on the verge of collapse. After nearly 3 years of slaughter, the soldiers were weary, the civilians starving, and the empires trembling under the weight of their own ambitions. It was in this crucible of despair that two events would change the course of the war, one in the east, one across the ocean. In Russia, the Tsarist Empire was crumbling. Millions of soldiers had died in vain, while peasants starved and cities descended into chaos. The people had lost faith in Tsar Nicholas II, a ruler hopelessly detached from his suffering nation. In March 1917, the streets of Petrograd erupted in protest. Soldiers refused to fire on the crowds, and within days, the Tsar abdicated. The February Revolution had ended 3 centuries of Romanov rule. A provisional government was formed, promising reform, but it made a fatal mistake. It chose to continue the war. The soldiers at the front, already broken by hunger and horror, could no longer bear it. Discipline dissolved, and Russia teetered on the edge of anarchy. In the shadows, another movement rose. The Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, promised peace, land, and bread. In October 1917, they seized power in a coup that stunned the world. The October Revolution had begun. Lenin immediately sought peace with Germany, seeing the war as a capitalist slaughter. In March 1918, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was signed, ending Russia's participation in the war. Germany now stood triumphant in the east, but in freeing itself from one front, it would awaken a new enemy far stronger than it had ever faced. Across the Atlantic, the United States had long clung to neutrality. President Woodrow Wilson, re-elected in 1916 on the slogan, "He kept us out of war, hoped to mediate peace." But German aggression made neutrality impossible. In 1915, a German submarine, a U-boat, had sunk the passenger liner Lusitania, killing 1,200 civilians, including Americans. Outrage simmered, but the final blow came in January 1917, when British intelligence intercepted the Zimmermann telegram, a secret message in which Germany promised Mexico the return of Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico if it joined the war against the United States. The revelation shocked the American public. On the 6th of April 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. Wilson framed the conflict not as conquest but as a moral crusade to make the world safe for democracy. For the first time, a nation across the ocean would intervene decisively in European affairs. American factories roared to life, and an army of millions began to train for war. By the end of 1917, the balance had shifted. Russia had fallen into revolution and chaos. America had entered the stage with boundless energy and resources. The old world was dying, and a new one was taking its place, forged in fire, blood, and the hope of redemption. Chapter 8: The Final Offensive, 1918. The year 1918 opened not with peace, but with fury. After Russia's withdrawal from the war, Germany suddenly found itself free from the Eastern Front. For the first time in years, the full might of the German army could be unleashed in the West. Its leaders knew this was their last chance. American troops were arriving in growing numbers, and soon the balance of power would tilt irrevocably against them. It was now or never. On the 21st of March 1918, Germany launched Operation Michael, the first blow of the Spring Offensive, a massive, desperate gamble to win the war before the United States could fully deploy its forces. Abandoning old tactics of massed assaults, the Germans used small, fast-moving stormtrooper units to infiltrate weak points in the Allied lines. The attack struck like a thunderclap. In days, British and French forces were driven back over 60 kilometers. Paris once again came under threat. German artillery could be heard in the city. For a moment, it seemed victory was within their grasp, but the triumph was fleeting. The German advance outran its own supply line. Hungry, exhausted soldiers slowed to a crawl, looting abandoned Allied depots for food. Meanwhile, the Allies regrouped under unified command, led by General Ferdinand Foch, coordinating British, French, and newly arriving American divisions. In April, Germany renewed its offensive along the Somme and Lys rivers, and again in May at the Marne. Each attack gained ground, but bled the German army white. By July, their momentum was gone. Then came the counterstroke. On the 8th of August 1918, the Allies struck back in what became known as the 100 Days Offensive. At Amiens, tanks, artillery, aircraft, and infantry moved as one a symphony of modern warfare. The Germans were overwhelmed. Over 27,000 were captured on the first day alone. General Ludendorff called it the Black Day of the German army. From that moment, Germany's collapse was inevitable. The Allies advanced relentlessly, breaking through the once impregnable Hindenburg Line. The Central Powers began to crumble. Bulgaria surrendered on September 29, the Ottoman Empire on October 30, and Austria-Hungary on November 3. Inside Germany, the home front erupted in revolt. Workers struck, sailors mutinied, and the cities fell into chaos. On November 9, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated and fled to the Netherlands. 2 days later, on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns finally fell silent. The Armistice of Compiègne had been signed. The Great War was over. Yet the silence that followed was not peace, but exhaustion. The world had been bled, dry its cities in ruins, its youth buried in mud. As soldiers emerged from the trenches, they found not victory, but a broken world that no one knew how to rebuild. Chapter 9. The Aftermath and the Lost Humanity. When the guns fell silent on the 11th of November 1918, the world stood in stunned disbelief. For more than 4 years, entire nations had been consumed by war, and now, at last, the killing had stopped. But what remained was not victory. It was ruin. The First World War had cost the lives of more than 16 million people, wounded another 20 million, and shattered the moral and political order of the old world. The very idea of progress that humanity was marching toward enlightenment lay buried beneath the mud of the trenches. Across Europe, cities were reduced to skeletons of stone and ash. Once proud towns like Ypres, Verdun, and Somme had been erased from the map. Entire landscapes were poisoned with shell craters, barbed wire, and the lingering ghosts of gas attacks. The survivors who returned home were not the same men who had left. They were scarred, disfigured, and haunted victims of what doctors began to call shell shock, now known as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. They had stared too long into the abyss of mechanized death, and the abyss had stared back. The war also brought the fall of empires that had stood for centuries. The German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian empires all collapsed under the weight of defeat and revolution. New nations were born from their ruins: Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia. But the peace that followed was fragile, stitched together by exhausted diplomats rather than understanding. The Treaty of Versailles, 1919, imposed crushing reparations and humiliation on Germany, blaming it entirely for the war. Rather than ensuring peace, it sowed resentment, a wound that would fester until it erupted again, only 2 decades later. Beyond Europe, the ripples of the Great War spread across the globe. Colonial subjects from Africa, Asia, and the Middle East who had fought and died for their imperial masters began to question why they still lived under foreign rule. The war had promised freedom and democracy, yet it had delivered only loss. Movements for independence rose in India, Indochina, and the Arab world, demanding self-determination. The old colonial order had been fatally weakened. But perhaps the greatest casualty of all was faith, not only religious faith, but faith in civilization itself. The war had revealed the dark heart of modernity, that science and progress, once hailed as instruments of human advancement, could also become tools of annihilation. Machine guns, poison gas, tanks, and bombers had turned human ingenuity into a weapon against humanity itself. In the end, the First World War was not just the Great War. It was the death of an age of reason, honor, and hope. The trenches had devoured a generation, and the peace that followed was only an intermission before another storm. The war had taught the world a bitter truth, that no victory is worth the price of a lost humanity. Only when the lessons of the graves are remembered, only when the living choose compassion over pride, can peace truly endure. And that's it for today's journey through history and language. If these stories moved you, remember, every new word you learn keeps history alive. Keep listening, keep feeling, and keep discovering the world through English. Thank you for staying with Historiclingo. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell, because next time we'll travel even deeper into the past. Until then, take care, keep learning, and never stop exploring the story of humanity.